weeks ago, I published a routine called Ribbon Fantastic. And Tony made a comment beneath Ribbon Fantastic about, and he kind of alluded to this, the Ghost Show. And we had just a brief exchange in that message beneath Ribbon Fantastic about this particular book, and it got me to thinking. This is an entire piece of magic history that I would wager you probably didn't know existed. I think a lot of people don't know it exists. So in doing this video, I'd like to call your attention to it, and also call your attention to this book. Mark Walker wrote this book, by the way. I have an interesting piece of trivia. This guy, I met him back in the early 80s. If he watches this video, he won't remember me, but he might remember this. Liberty Publishing Company. I was the sales manager for Liberty Publishing Company in the mid-80s. In the mid-80s, Mark Walker published his first book. It was a book on Halloween costumes. And guess who published it? Liberty Publishing Company. So I was the sales manager that was selling one of his first books. Now he went on, I was a magician at the time, but I didn't know that Mark Walker was a magician. He went on to write a number of great magic histories. He went on to become an expert in the field of magic history. And I mean, I've always felt privileged that I was the sales manager that sold his first book. So anyway, that's a little piece of trivia there. But he did write this book, Ghostmasters. Ghostmasters is a book that focuses on a particular historical period in magic history, spanning from roughly 1929 or 1930 all the way up into the 1960s. Here's what happened. Let me give you my sense for this history. You won't find it in this book, but let me give you my sense. In the 1800s, particularly the end of the 1800s, vaudeville really came into its own. Now, what made vaudeville viable? See, at the time, you had people working jobs that afforded them some leisure activity, some leisure time, some discretionary spending money. You also had the ability to get a show from one place to the other via the railroad or other methods. And you had these theaters opening up everywhere. And so, obviously, film had not come on the scene, so live entertainment was the thing to do. Vaudeville grew from roughly the 1890s all up into the 1930s. Now, what happened in the 1920s that really signaled the death of vaudeville? Remember now, vaudeville provided employment for variety acts, performance artists, and magicians for decades. And so in the early 1900s, going up into the 1920s, you had the advent and growth of the cinema industry, theatrical film. Movie houses began to replace vaudeville theaters. And as that transition happened, as entertainment transitioned from live entertainment in vaudeville to theatrical cinema, you had performance artists losing their jobs. Now you had acts like Burns and Allen, for example, going into television, or going into theater, or going into film. You had acts like Buster Keaton, who was a vaudeville act, transitioning into film. Charlie Chaplin transitioning into film. You had all these transitions happening. But the magician, magic is a live performance art. You just can't get it. I know there's been a lot of magic on television. There's a lot of magic on YouTube. But at the end of the day, magic is a live performance art. So somebody, and that somebody is actually named in this book, L. Wynne, is credited as being the first magician to get this idea. And here's the idea. So your theater is closing. Your venue for performing magic is closing. But what is opening and what is growing is the movie house. So, how do you take your magic act, which was which was presented and geared for the vaudeville stage, and transitioned it to the movie house. So Elwyn approached movie house managers and said, wouldn't it be great to do a midnight horror show? Now in the 1920s, remember this is the period where Universal horror, the classics, were just beginning to come onto the scene. So you had Nosferatu, you had the career of Lon Chaney, you had the career of Lon Chaney Jr., you had Frankenstein, you had The Wolfman, you had The Invisible Man, you had all these films hitting. So Elwyn approaches these movie house managers and says, wouldn't it be cool to do a midnight show? Now they weren't showing films at midnight. So through a theatrical film theater manager, this is extra revenue, right? It's not going to interfere with your show times. It's going to bring in extra revenue to your theater. It's a win-win for everybody. And I don't mean to pun on the name Elwyn, but he presented a win-win for the movie house and for himself. So they agreed to allow him to come in and perform the midnight show. Now these are often called ghost shows. They're sometimes called spook shows and sometimes called the midnight horror show. I personally prefer that last title, the midnight horror show, because that's exactly what it was. So once Elwyn kind of opened up the opportunity, magicians jumped on it. And so you had really from 1930, because the very first midnight horror show was in 1929, performed by Elwyn. So after he kind of opened up that opportunity for magicians, the floodgates were open. This particular book, you can see here, you've got several pages on Elwyn, then you've got Greystoke, then you've got Blackout is a method, not necessarily a performer. And so you go through the book, and what Mark does is he presents you with acts, Blackstone. He presents you with acts and how they presented their act in the movie house from 1930 to the 1960s. In the 1960s, unfortunately, for whatever reason, and I don't really understand the reasons, this particular type of act just fell out of vogue, and we really haven't seen it since. But I'm guessing that you probably know what vaudeville is, a form of entertainment that prospered and grew from the late 1800s up until the movies really displaced them. And then you had from the time vaudeville died up into the 1960s, you had magicians doing ghost shows, midnight horror shows. And these were just, imagine going into a theater and seeing ghosts manifest or seeing monsters manifest. That's what these guys did. I mean, and one of the things I love about this book is the photographs of the acts that took place in movie houses. You know. By the way, if you've never seen a vintage theater, we have one in Baltimore called the Senator, down on I think it's on Charles Street, or York Road. It's on York Road. I'm sorry. But these old theaters had stages and they had curtains, so you really had all the trappings of theater back in these days. And that might be, by the way, that might be why the ghost show disappeared, because the staging changed in the 1960s. But this book is just fantastic. It gives you the history of the performers who did it. It shows you a little bit about their marketing, and it describes their act. Here is a ticket office with a man by a skeleton. I just think this is great stuff. I mean, I remember growing up in the 1960s watching the creature feature on Saturday night and watching the ghost host it. And I wanted so much to bring that back. I went to every television station in Maryland to pitch the idea of doing a late night Saturday night hosted horror movie, and everyone said the same thing. People can Google it, people can get it for free, they don't need a horror movie host. The thing is, the horror movie host interacted with the audience and posed a little fun at the movies. It's a shame that we're losing chunks of our art over time. This is history, folks. It's history. There are bizarrists today who are doing horror-style magic or magic with a macabre bend. But the horror show, the midnight horror show, the ghost show, really doesn't exist anymore. It's a piece of history. Hey, Tony, I know you took a look at the book. Hopefully, flipping through this book and showing it to you, it's worth the investment. It's worth the investment. I know that when you buy magic books, and here's the thing, magic books don't appeal to a mass audience, okay? They appeal to a much narrower audience. The publishers know that, and that's why, generally speaking, a magic book is a little pricier than a mass market book, because the print run is smaller and the audience is more narrow. So the publisher needs to make the money back with a tighter sales. You see what I'm saying? But these books are worth the investment. They really are. Folks, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate that you do. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Please comment down below. I will talk to you later. Have a great day. Thank you so much.